Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to do a non-spoiler review for Foul Days. This is a story that its comp titles instantly had me both intrigued and also a little bit skeptical, as it was being compared to Naomi Novik's, specifically Naomi Novik's more folklore-inspired works, so something like Spinning Silver, that and Witcher. And those are two that are definitely ones that I absolutely adore, and so when I saw the comp titles, while I was instantly wanting to pick the book up and have it be on my radar, I also felt as though those comp titles were maybe going to set me up for some unrealistic expectations. It's often the same case when you find books are incredibly overhyped, or just hyped in general. Overhyped is of course subjective, but when things are incredibly hyped, it's often impossible for the book to ever be as good as the hype has made it out to be. And I was quite nervous that that would be the situation here. However, while I don't actually think it's that similar to Naomi Novik and Andrzej Sapkowski's work, I did instantly start to find myself really invested in what was happening in the story. And the more I read, the more I fell in love with it. And it has turned out to probably be one of the biggest surprises of the year for me. I promise I'll stray away from the topic of comp titles here in a second, but I did want to note that I don't think this is one of those situations where the comp titles, there are absolutely no parallels and that marketing just threw whatever at the wall to see what stuck. I do see why there was the comparison made, as there are a lot of Eastern European influences within this work, which is true, of course, of Naomi Novik's folklore-inspired stories and the Witcher series. However, I do think aside from that more broad category, I wouldn't say that there was too much about Foul Days that felt like Witcher or Naomi Novik, but I also don't think it felt too much like most anything I've picked up. It simultaneously had pieces of fantasy that felt familiar, while executing the unveiling of the plot, the character development, their arcs, their relationship building, and the world itself. All of that came to life in a way that felt comfortable. It didn't feel too artistic in a way that it was convoluted, and it didn't feel as though it was just hitting the same story beats that we've seen over and over again. It somehow had that wonderful blend of feeling familiar and unique. And I love when stories can accomplish that. I think it's a really difficult feat, and I absolutely felt that the author did that in this story. I am surprised because when I first picked it up, the thing that I was finding myself most intrigued by was the world itself. I am somebody who tends to more so gravitate toward characters, and I do think that the characterization within this was fantastic, and that it was revealed to you slowly, but in a way that felt organic to how you actually get to know real people. You don't know everything about them instantly. You get to see something on the surface, and then it's when you start to dive deeper that you really get to know them. And I think that that was done very well in this, very seamlessly across the story. But the world is something that is just instantly, you have to understand and see it for what it is for this setting to really come to life. So the way in which the world is set up is you have our main character living within this city called Chernograd. And there is another city on the other side of a wall that separates the two. It is known that the other city is just filled with elite individuals, very wealthy people, and people who are living in privilege and safety, specifically from the monsters that live within Chernograd. But the monsters themselves, while present, they do have witches that can fight back and help keep people safe. On top of that, there are a certain set of days at the beginning of each year, known as the Foul Days, where the line between their world and the world of monsters has made it so that it's much easier to cross, and monsters come through during these days, and there's so many that everybody essentially just holes up and hides and tries to make it for those 12 days. Of the people that can fight back against the monsters and that can set up wards and who have knowledge to fight them if something does happen are the witches, and that is including our main character named Kusara. Kusara does not necessarily think of herself as a witch with extraordinary abilities. She has knowledge, she has some prowess when it comes to fire specifically, but she also has a weakness, and that weakness happens to be the Tsar of monsters, Zmei. And that individual is somebody who is a lot more human than the rest of the monsters, but also is so much more powerful than the rest of the monsters. And you gather pretty quickly, right at the start of the story is the beginning of the Foul Days, that Kasara has some kind of past with the Tsar of Monsters. What that past entails, you don't know. This is where what I was referring to before, the way in which you get pieces of the characters, but you don't get the full picture until the story is complete. This is a perfect example of that. You can clearly tell that there's something, as she is unnaturally fearful of him. It seems as though her fear is rooted in something that has occurred, and you don't know the details of that, but right away you understand that she is desperate to get away from him. He has found her, and she ends up bargaining away her shadow. And this is so that she can try to escape the Tsar of Monsters. She makes this bargain with somebody who happens to have access to the other side of the wall where the monsters cannot reach her. And she is so desperate that she takes this chance, even knowing that witches' powers derive from their shadows. And if they do not have their shadows, eventually there will be this sickness that takes them. And that sickness involves them slowly turning into a shadow themselves. There were so many aspects of just that, which is all very much in the beginning of the story, that I was like, oh wow, that's cool. Oh, that's interesting. I want to know more of what's going on here. And I just found myself instantly gravitating towards wanting to turn the page and find out what was going to happen next, what other cool world building details would be revealed, who told on Kasara, who told the Tsar of Monsters where Kasara would be, because she did everything she could to ensure that she was going to be safe during the Foul Days, and then he found her immediately. So it seems like maybe somebody knows and that they have betrayed her, and so then you're wondering what's going on with that. And on top of all of that, because she has bargained away her shadow, she now has a timeline of how long she can live, as immediately the sickness is starting to take her. And she happens to have been thrust onto the other side of the wall, and for the first time pretty much ever in her entire life, she's actually seeing how the other side lives, what it's like to be in luxury and safety constantly. But she also recognizes that if she is ever going to survive, she needs to get her shadow back from the person that she bargained it away to. And she ends up allying with a very unlikely of allies, and that would be a very by-the-books detective, who seems to be sort of roped into her situation after there is a murder that occurs that is relevant to Kasara's plotline. So these two, despite butting heads in both personality, in backgrounds, they have to join forces to try and get Kasara's shadow back and also solve this murder mystery. I fell in love with so many aspects of the story. As I mentioned, the setting was one of the first things that really gripped me and pulled me in. But I do think that the author did something really creative with how the world was opened up to you as the reader, in that it was very much mirroring how everything was opening up for Kasara. You only really know about Chernograd, and you only really know about this world through this character, as she is your main perspective that you were following throughout the story. And you don't know that much about what happens beyond the wall besides what Kasara has an understanding of when it comes to what happens across the wall. So you have an idea of these, you could almost say, time period that the story takes place in, just based off of the technology that they have, the way they speak, and the things that are a part of their everyday life. So you have this feeling, you feel somewhat like you're starting to get grounded, you're learning about the Foul Days, you're learning about the wall, you're learning about the lore of the city, you're learning about witches and their shadows. And then when the world opens up, suddenly you're like, oh, I don't think that this world is exactly what I thought it was, which I think really hit home the differences between Chernograd and the other side of the wall, the other city. It really felt like the book existed within two different settings, and I think it's hard to accomplish something like that, to create that feeling. And so where I'm going with this is, and I don't like saying this phrase because I do think it gets overused in reviews, but you hear people say, show, don't tell. Don't just tell me, and this is where I'm saying I think it's applicable here though, don't just tell me that the other side is different. Don't just tell me that the other side lives in more comfort than the people of Chernograd. Actually show me how different it is when our character is exposed to it, and make me as the reader feel unsettled. Make it feel as though the rug was pulled out from under me because you feel you have a grasp on the world, and then you realize, oh, I don't have a grasp on the world at all. And I really liked that feeling. It did throw me off at first because it almost, to some degree, seemed as though the author hadn't and I'm not saying this literally, but it almost came across like the author hadn't really thought through the world, because this side has certain technology and then this side doesn't, and it's like, wait, what time period is this? But that was perfect. That was the perfect way to capture, in my opinion, how different life really was and just how much our character doesn't know. That's another thing that I think is difficult to accomplish, is when you have a story where a character has only lived within a certain set of rules, or they live within a certain place, within a certain culture in this world, you, as the reader, almost always recognize, oh, you're sheltered. And then it's just not that big of a surprise when it turns out, oh, yep, they were sheltered. Look at it, things are different over there. And I think the author actually captured that feeling of like, oh, wait, this is not at all what I thought. And I really, really enjoyed that element of it. Due to the nature of the setting, there are certainly very high stakes. We have these monsters that if you turn the wrong corner and you're not well equipped, you could instantly be killed by them. You have these spirits living in people's homes. There are certainly things about the story that are scary and that showcase that our main character is very much in danger. On top of that, you also see that she is suffering from this shadow sickness, which not only puts a timeline on how much life she has left to live and how much time she has to try and get her shadow back, but as a result of not even having her shadow, the things that she would normally feel well equipped to handle, she no longer can. So you're just constantly wondering if she's going to be okay, what's going to happen next, how is she going to get out of this situation. But despite that, I do think while there are high levels of stakes, and while there are elements to this that are certainly creepy, I also found that there is a maintained level of cheekiness throughout the entirety of the story that just made everything so much fun. So anytime our characters would go from one place to the next, you kind of were just accompanying them there. They're trying to ask this person for help. They're trying to trick this person. They're now headed to this graveyard, which is not only a dangerous thing to do in general, but it's especially dangerous during the foul days. But there's always just something funny happening also, whether it's the way the characters think about stuff, how tired they are of everything, the way in which that they get on each other's nerves. There was just always something that sort of lightened the mood. It's not that it made everything into a giant joke. It was just like this nice level of scary, adventurous, and funny at the same time. I do want to note, though, I think maybe for some people, the story might bleed a little bit into being a little too cheeky, because I know for some people, when they're picking something up that has the potential to be truly frightening, they want it to lean more into the horror, or they want it to lean more into the frightening. And this book, by having a lot of funny moments throughout, maybe takes away from that. And it's just a matter of taste. For me, I thought that the balance worked incredibly. I don't just think that the balance worked as far as scary versus funny. I also think that some of these lighter moments that we get throughout the story were very nice to have mixed in with some of the heavier themes that we see. I do find that discovering more about these characters was one of the things that made this book have a little bit more depth for me, and went just from being a cool world and fun characters to feeling like something that had a lot of meaning to it. The specific theme that I am referencing has to do with the quiet ways in which an abuser can inflict harm on someone. And I'm specifically using the word quiet, as I do think that there are, in certain stories, certain villainous characters that are very loud with the intentions that they have, with the evil that they want to commit. But sometimes there are stories where, and sadly instances in real life, where from the outside looking in, you don't really know the situation. You might have an inkling, but you don't have the full extent of just how much harm is being caused and how much hurt is being inflicted. And I do think that this book tackled that in a way that was very realistic. Part of why it was realistic is that even though you want very badly, when a writer is being upfront about these sorts of themes, you don't in any way want to romanticize the situation. And in doing so, you sometimes make the abuser almost cartoonish in their level of villainy. And realistically, oftentimes there is a reason that people who are inflicting harm, there is a reason that they find they're able to manipulate other individuals. And it's because there are glimpses of their humanity. There's glimpses that there is a person beneath all of that. And oftentimes it's not even glimpses. It's that is at the forefront, and it's the other side, it's the villainous side that only the person who's being harmed even sees those glimpses of, and they don't see it until they're already really locked into that situation. Thus, when the harm starts to happen, it's sometimes the situation where the person starts to excuse it, they justify it, they tell themselves it was an accident, they didn't mean it, and it can be very difficult to disentangle these complicated feelings when that harm is starting to become more and more prevalent in the person's life. And I think that the way the author showed all of that, I think that it's very difficult to put that into a fantasy story. It's very difficult to put that into a story within all these other things, all these other ingredients that you have to flesh out. But I thought the way it was executed, I think it's going to really click with a lot of people. I think a lot of individuals, whether they've experienced this or not, maybe they have, or maybe somebody they know has experienced that, or maybe they've just heard about it. I think they're going to see this and it's going to maybe shed a little bit of light. And for that reason, that's one of the many things that I thought was done great about this story. It was a pleasant surprise, I guess you could say, despite the fact that the nature of what I'm discussing is not pleasant in the slightest. But I think to accomplish this, the author really had to, like I said before, they had to balance out so many things really carefully, and I think that they did that. Ending on a slightly happier note, I do want to tie everything full circle by talking a little bit about the folklore inspirations. I did mention that I can see the comparisons to things like Witcher, and that's because there are so many stories that I think are going to be extremely recognizable, or characters that are going to be extremely recognizable to a lot of individuals who have picked up a lot of fantasy or maybe are very familiar with this set of folklore. But for me, the way that the author tied it in, it wasn't sort of bleeding into retellings territory, as the entirety of the story wasn't just taking this one thing and then doing something slightly different with it. It was that we have almost like when you have bits and pieces of fairy tales mixed into a story. That's kind of the feeling that I got. And it was fun because sometimes it was just a single line and you're like, oh, that's clever, I know what they're referencing there. And sometimes it was a character that our main perspective found herself having to ally with temporarily, and then you get a little bit of their backstory or bits and pieces of their lore, and it sometimes aligns with what we've seen before, and sometimes it is something completely different, and there's this idea of, oh yeah, people make up tall tales, reputations, you can just make what you will of them. And so it was really fun to see those things. It's kind of this, in no way am I saying that this entire story reminds me of Shadow of the Gods, the Bloodsworn series by John Gwynne, but the Bloodsworn series is Norse inspired, and while it is its own original story, occasionally there are snippets within the lore where you're like, I know what that's in reference to, and it's just kind of fun to see. And I think that Foul Days, it's a little more upfront with its lore tie-ins, but I still thought it was so fun to get those glimpses and those tastes throughout the story. But anyway, if you have seen this story around, if it's something that sounds like it might be somewhat up your alley, I had a blast with this book. It was an unexpected favorite for me of the year. I do think that there are going to be a lot of things about this that are going to appeal to a lot of people. If there's one thing that maybe isn't going to resonate, I would say it has to do with the tone and the fact that while I appreciated that rug being pulled out from under you setting aspect to it, I could see some people just feeling like they're never really firmly having their feet on the ground and that they wish that the tone maybe was a little bit different. But I thought it was fantastic. I loved so much about this story, and I can't wait for the sequel. If I understand correctly, I believe the sequel is also going to come out the same year that this first book was published. So if you're somebody who usually prefers to wait before you pick up stories, I believe the conclusion of this duology will also be released the year that this has come out. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.